Connect Groups, good morning. We're back in Mark chapter 9, and we're looking ahead in a few weeks to Palm Sunday and Easter, where Jesus will begin in Mark's Gospel to talk about what's going to happen to him as he goes to Jerusalem. But on that way, on that journey, they pulled into Capernaum to have maybe a rest or a recovery period. They're in presumably Peter's home. There's children around, and on the way, the children of God, as it were, disciples, were having some debate and discussion and even argument over which one of them was the greatest. So that sets up a discussion that Jesus will have with them that felt a lot like if you've ever sat down with your kid and they've done something wrong, and you take the opportunity to not just address what they've been doing wrong, but you say to yourself, while you're here, let me kind of talk about some of the other issues that have been disturbing me. And Jesus has that way of putting a lot together into one conversation, so that at the beginning he addresses the problem, which is they're arguing over who's the greatest, and then at the end he simply says, peace, be at peace with one another. But in the middle, there's three kind of big buckets of ideas that address their problem of arguing and considering who's the greatest. The first was an understanding of what it means to be a servant and to be a leader. So this idea of servant leadership, and Jesus invites them into that by saying, if you really want to be the first, if you really want to be the greatest, then you must be the last. So that's one area that you can discuss tonight, or whenever your group meets, is talk about servant leadership. What does it look like to become the last of all? What does it look like to become the servant of all? That's setting up for Jesus another topic that you could discuss, kind of a second bucket of ideas, and that relates to judgment, where Jesus invites us, secondly, to consider our actions because they have eternal consequences. So Jesus is using phrases like, if your hand causes you to stumble, then it's better to cut it off. So Jesus doesn't lecture on how awful the disciples are, how filled with sin they are. He just says, if your hand causes you to stumble. So he invites us to evaluate our own actions, and then reminds us that there is a consequence for eternity. And so having a discussion with one another about how our actions impact us, but also how do we evaluate? How do we make decisions in the short term? Sometimes in our humanity we're thinking, I just got to get through today. I was recently at a drug treatment facility and learned a lot from the program director on how many folks who are trapped in addiction, they're not really considering a long-term future. They're just thinking about that moment, how do I curb this current pain that I'm in? And whether someone's addicted to a substance or not, there's so much to be said about how our actions in the short term need to be understood in that longer term. And that's what Jesus is saying, that if there's something going on in our life that's causing a repeated stumbling, something that would hinder us or hinder others, we should be working to cut that out of our life, to remove that. And then lastly, there's a big bucket of ideas related to purification or maybe preservation, related to the salt. So Jesus invites us to consider the preserving effect of his good news, of his presence, of his love in our life. So this idea of salt, and in the Dead Sea area, the idea that salt wouldn't be mined under the earth, but could be cultivated by drying out the water and letting the salt and the crystals form that have been formed kind of separate out, so that you could lose your saltiness, so that the actual, what you would consider the composite of the salt, could actually be broken out. And this whole idea then is that there's parts of our life that really need to be preserved. It's saying salt is good, and we should be salty in that way. But there's other things that could kind of come around us, and how do we preserve what Jesus has put there, so that the ideas kind of work together? If you think about, hey, disciples, you're arguing over something that's quite strange. Which one of us is the greatest? If we really understood greatness, we'd understood servanthood, being a servant leader. And secondly, if we really understood greatness, we'd be thinking, how do I remove things that cause me to stumble? I want to be removing things, not promoting myself. And then thirdly, I want to be thinking about preservation. What is been given to me in Christ, in who I am in Christ, that I want to be holding dear to and holding on to, not losing it or being at risk of having it colluded, so that our focus isn't on, wow, I've arrived and I'm great. Our focus is, oh Lord, continue to work in me and do good works in me, and when I'm going to be evaluating myself with others, I'm going to put myself as a servant, as someone submitted to serving other people. So you could talk about servant leadership, you could talk about our preparation for our actions with eternal impact, or talk about what it looks like to preserve. What's the essence of what it is to be in Christ, and how do we preserve that? How do we keep that? I'll just let those big ideas sit there, let you work around them and work with them, but we're in Mark chapter 9, verse 33 through 50, and I know God's Spirit will help you have some robust discussion, and then hopefully some good prayer. Just talking and then letting those prayer points emerge from that. Have a great time, and God bless.